Hello, we're about to head into conversation with Alan Wolk. We'll be discussing everything from Fast to the iPhone 15 and Judge Judy and my watching habits. But other than that, we'll also be discussing how local broadcasters can go OTT, especially given the current landscape. So let's see what he had to say.
You can find this podcast on simplestream.com, as well as on your favourite platforms, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and more. If you enjoyed the show, follow us, leave a review, join the conversation, and leave a comment on LinkedIn and Twitter. You can find Simplestream and Beyond the Stream there too.
Hi, this is Edward here with Alan Wolk. He is the co-founder of the leading media industry consulting firm TVREV. He's a best-selling author, razor-sharp and witty industry commentator, and all I do is actually host this podcast. So I'm wondering, Alan, it's a question that's been bothering me since I found out all of these interesting facts about you and all your achievements. Do you find time for hobbies as well?
Yes, I do. A couple of hobbies. Big one is CrossFit. I have been doing CrossFit for 9 years. It's sort of my social life, and it's a way to get out of my head and not think about work or anything other than what I'm doing at the moment. Do it 5 days a week. And I travel a lot. That's another big hobby. I get to travel a lot for work, and I always try and extend the trips and see all parts of the world. It's been great. This year I've been so many interesting places. Probably the most interesting was Newfoundland, Canada, which would have never gone to on my own. But funny enough, my father had been stationed there when he was in the U.S. Army many, many years ago. So it was kind of neat to get up there.
Oh, wow. Well, that's really interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
I'd love to travel for work as well. I do my best to get them to get me decent flights and maybe a later one back, but it doesn't always work.
Yeah.
But that's great. And the interesting thing about your past as well, Alan, is you actually coined the term everyone uses to describe one of our industry's hottest topics, and it's arguably hotter than the iPhone 15 is right now. So free, and that's free ad-supported TV or FAST. And there
Yeah.
seems to be a lot of confusion as well in the industry about what FAST services are versus FAST channels. So I was
Yeah.
wondering if you would be able to clear up the differences there and whether it actually matters to the consumer.
Yeah, sure. So fast services are the big aggregator companies that have that sort of put out the app. So whether it's the ones that are owned by the media companies like Pluto TV and Zumo and Tubi, or the ones that are owned by the manufacturers like Samsung TV Plus, Vizio Watch Free, the Roku channel, LG channels, and Amazon Freevee. And then there's independents, there's Crackle TV, and there's smaller ones like Reverie and things like that. You've got what they do is they aggregate a bunch of both linear channels and on-demand content, and they basically put them in a single app. They sell advertising against them, and those are actually what we were thinking of when we came up with the term fast. There is something called fast channels because a lot of the fast, Pluto TV was really the first one to do this, have linear channels as well. But the truth is, all of the fast services have both linear channels and on-demand content. And one of the big trends we're seeing now is that they're working to better integrate them. The idea being the consumer journey is I'll start watching something on a linear channel and go, oh, I really like this show. I want to catch up on it. And then they'll be able to sort of watch it on the on-demand. You see that in the interface too, where you're scrolling through the linear channels and they'll have a movie sort of called out and say, watch this on our on demand. So that's all happening. And then the final point on that is that while linear channels, which are called fast channels now, all of the subscription services are looking at making linear channels. So two of the big ones, Paramount and Peacock, already have linear channels. And everybody else is thinking, what a great way to surface our library content. We've got so many shows, especially now that they're doing ad supported, that if you're watching a linear channel, you watch longer, and if you want someone to watch ads, even better. So I think the term fast channel is just going to go away in terms of channel or linear channel, whatever. As for your other question, do consumers know the difference? I don't think so. I think consumers, and one of the things I've been curious about, even and have yet to see research, is do consumers differentiate between the FAST that are attached to the OEMs? Like, say they have a Vizio TV, Watch Free Plus comes up on their TV. Do they think to themselves, "Oh, this is the same thing as Pluto, which I get through an app"? I don't know that they necessarily do. So I'm curious, as much as that it's an industry term.
Yeah,
So we'll
yeah, no,
see.
I could definitely see that. I mean, when I'm on my 8 hour watch binge of like Judge Judy, like I don't really notice, and I wouldn't have
Yeah,
noticed before. But obviously, since joining the industry, now I'm well
yeah,
versed in it, as you you yourself are. And I mean, one of the interesting things that comes up in this as well is, and you would have covered this in your recent research, is like thematic advertising and
yeah.
whether that thematic advertising can actually be applied to those fast channels realistically. Because obviously, a lot of these fast channels now you're accessing for free, sometimes without any login information. So you don't really know who's watching on the other side. So I saw a lot of research that you'd done yourself about thematic advertising based on data points from things like localization and like
Right.
things like the weather. So could you maybe explain a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, sure. So as you had mentioned, they don't necessarily know who the viewer is, but they certainly know where they live. They're able to sort of use the IP address to understand where the person is living and like things like the weather. So as an easy example, if I'm a car company and I have ads about my windshield wipers and I know that it's raining in Detroit, I can make sure that my ads in Detroit are all about my great new windshield wipers and storm systems and whatnot. So that's a huge thing. It also allows for localization down to a very zip code level or even sub zip code level with some of the companies where I can advertise. If I have, say, a chain of stores, I can, and I know that they only hit certain parts of a large metro area. I can just hit those zip codes, which is great. And that's going to really play out in the US in 2024 in terms of political advertising. So there's a lot of what they call down ballot races or smaller, like for state legislature or city council. And you don't necessarily, you can't really, most of those candidates don't have the money to buy traditional TV for the entire metro area if it's someplace big like New York or Los Angeles, but they can buy certain zip codes in there. And that's going to be a big game changer in terms of that, because now they all do have video ads because they run ads on YouTube and other sort of social video services. So I think it's really going to see a lot of spending going to streaming because of that.
Yeah, and that localization you talk about, obviously, you've got things like in the political landscape in America, especially, you've got those smaller areas like they might want to just target a specific district. And what's interesting about that in terms of localization for advertising, especially from my perspective, is that you can then have things like local advertising, which had its place on a local broadcast channel, like maybe syndicated from a larger network. Like you could have individual restaurants even in that area that want to run an ad. Where are they going to find their place in the future? Because obviously we've got local broadcasters now, maybe shying away from just being on like cable in the US or a terrestrial in the UK. Do you think they're going to find a space where they can actually advertise in a much more localized way with OTT?
Oh, very much so. We just did a whole report on local TV and streaming, which I'll give a plug, is available for free on the TVREV website. And we did a consumer study with it as well, which is interesting. That consumers are definitely still watching local television, even younger consumers, even 25-year-olds are still watching local TV. They're often watching it on streaming. A lot of the local broadcasters and local services are moving to the fast and moving to streaming. But nonetheless, people want their local news. I mean, in the UK, there's a feeling national news is very London centric. In the US, it's very, coastal centric, New York, California. And so people in the rest of the country want to know what's going on in their region. So they're very much interested in it. There's also a lot of local, sort of syndicated things, talk shows. I mean, people always forget that Oprah Winfrey herself started out on a local talk show in Baltimore, Maryland. And there's a lot of heart for that, and there's a place for it on streaming. these companies make the move. And I think that the local advertisers are well positioned. They have relationships with the local stations for years and years, the people who are selling local TV, and they can just sort of transition them. And the other great thing that we've been hearing is, say, for example, I'm going to make this up. I have a chain of stores, and most of them are in Philadelphia, but there's one or two that are in Harrisburg. I can just buy those zip codes in Harrisburg. I don't have to buy the entire Harrisburg metro. And that way, it really gives a great way for these local advertisers to hit the audiences that they're looking for.
And on that point, Alan, I'd actually like to pose something to you. I want you to imagine that you yourself are a local broadcaster right now. So it could be in the States, UK, probably more the States, just for argument's sake. But if your task now was to start delivering media, OTT, and move beyond cable, how would you approach it?
I would really look to the data. So the great thing about digital is that there's a ton of data that I can use to sort of personalize the feeds. So for news, in the U.S., a bunch of the cable networks, Charter Spectrum in particular, have been running 24-hour local news stations for a long time, like at least 30 years. And they're quite successful. So I'd use that as a model, but then I would be able to personalize all that newsfeed. In other words, if I'm in Los Angeles and I know that somebody's living in the San Fernando Valley, I can make sure that news about that area shows up first and that it's focused on that. If I know that they're a big Dodgers fan, I can make sure that they see sports news over other news. I mean, one of the most interesting things about the consumer survey we found was that people actually choose their local news broadcast based on the weather people, far more than the news anchors or anyone else. The weather reports seem to be the big thing for them. So that's something else that you can, there's localized weather coverage. And then the other thing I would start doing is looking to make my own content. There's a lot of low cost content, be it talk shows or courtroom shows, the sort of Judge Judy stuff, game shows, things that are very easy to produce, not a high cost, and give people something unique to watch. Especially if I was a local broadcaster that was part of a group, then that could be syndicated. In other words, if I'm part of a group that owns local broadcast stations in 50 different markets, I can amortize the cost of production across those 50 markets. And I think those are the two big things to look at, and then getting in as many places as possible. In other words, strike deals with as many of the different fast services as possible to make sure that I'm on their service so that my viewers can see me, and then make sure that they know that I'm there. That would be the last step. There's a lot of marketing involved in this and letting audiences know and how easy it is to actually find it.
Getting onto those fast platforms you were speaking about, the larger ones, it's a nice idea, but at least for our side in the UK, we're finding that a lot of maybe smaller owned and operated channels and things are actually finding it quite difficult because it's become such a saturated market for them to get onto those channels. So then for them to be able to actually get their content out there, a lot of them are going direct to consumer. So do you see a similar thing in the US, or is it slightly different?
It's slightly different. There's much where the FAST are actually looking at, sort of because they're national to kind of get a leg up. So they're looking, they realize that news is a very popular topic. It keeps people watching longer. That's a huge thing. So somebody will turn on a news station, especially if it's a 24-hour news channel. They might watch for 2, 3, 4 hours, as opposed to if they're just watching a sitcom, they might watch 1 or 2 episodes and they're out. So if you're running ads against it, that's a positive thing. It also creates much more loyalty to that app, gives them an identity. So we're starting to see a lot of the FAST are actually very interested in getting local news. They started with what they call the O&Os, the owned and operated stations. So the weird laws of the United States, the networks can only own, I think it's 39% of the channels that carry the stations that carry their content. So the ones that they own are called owned and operated, and everyone else is an affiliate and they're independently owned. So a lot of the owned and operated stations already have deals with the FAST or with the subscription service, like that is part of that. So in other words, CBS is owned and operated station. CBS is owned by Paramount, so they're on Paramount Plus. and we're starting to see a lot more of that too. The problem with with having an independent app is that it's just hard to sort of break through the clutter to get people to find the app and download it. And there's also so many different platforms you have to be on. You have to be on all the OEM platforms, plus Apple TV and all the TV manufacturers, Roku, Amazon Fire TV. It's not an easy, it's a lot of money to sort of make that many apps and then constantly update them.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's a lot of maintenance to do there.
Yeah.
And moving on from actually just like local owned and operated channels, in the US, you've seen recently a lot of strikes by actors and writers stirring things up in your industry.
Yes.
And I've sort of seen that that's kind of trickled from Hollywood production companies right down to streaming services themselves. Do you think that that's going to affect the way that consumers are getting their content, and whether these streaming services are going to be able to operate realistically when stocking their content libraries?
Well, it's an interesting thing. So in the US, there was something called the Cable Act of 1992. And basically what it said was that the MVPDs, the cable companies, had to pay the various networks, whether the broadcast networks or the cable networks, money in order to carry their signal. So it was called retrans for the broadcast networks, retransmission, or carriage fees for the cable networks. And that amounted to tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars just flowing into the industry every year. So just an easy example of how much money we're talking about right now. In their Q2 earnings report, Fox, which doesn't have a holding, which has like a handful of stations, certainly fewer than a CBS or an ABC. So they had $1.77 billion in revenue from that. So that's just in one quarter, one network group. So it's an incredible amount of money that was coming in, and that was able to fund some, large salaries, lavish, expenses, production expenses. You could go shoot Game of Thrones for, all around the world for $10 million an episode. And, that's all going to sort of come crashing to a halt slowly but surely. But that doesn't mean that the industry is screwed. In the rest of the world, the television industry has been quite successful, in the UK, and there's no carriage and retrans fees, and people have managed to make very good livings and and be successful and pay their shareholders and all that. So I think the US industry sort of needs, and they're starting to realize it needs to sort of adapt to the fact that there was this 30-year period in the 90s, aughts, and teens when the industry just made, unthinkable sums of money, and that's gone, but it'll still be a very successful industry. Now, in terms of how that affects the consumer is, prices will probably go down a little bit. What would happen is that the MVPDs would basically pass on whatever they were paying to the cable and broadcast networks to the consumer. They would just jack up the price of a subscription, and so the consumer was paying for it. We think subscription prices for streaming are going to go up some. There'll be more ads in general. And the other big thing we're going to see is there was this race, in the last couple of years to produce as many original series as possible. And that's sort of unsustainable. I mean, they're realizing it didn't really matter. In other words, you weren't getting as many people watching it as you thought. People would catch one or two series, and that was it. So I think the trend now, what I'm seeing is let's make a handful of really good series that people want to watch rather than 75 mediocre ones and hope that one of them catches on. The other thing, which is going to be very interesting, I don't know how it's going to play out. In the old days, this is very US-centric, the TV networks would produce about 25 episodes a season of their shows. I know in the UK, a lot of times it's something like 6 or 8. You see classic shows like Faulty Towers have these small seasons. But, shows in the US like The Office or Friends, would have 10 years of 25 episodes, so they have 250 episodes, and that's the sort of thing where you could stand up a channel, or just even if it wasn't a channel, you could watch a different episode every night for a year and not feel like you were getting bored or watching the same thing over and over. And the industry really needs those sorts of shows for their library content. It's a certain way of watching, or it's a very familiar thing. They call it comfort food TV. And there's a lot of that. And are we going to start seeing that come back where they're going to say, okay, rather than just make 10 episodes, we're going to make 25. It's a sitcom. It's not that expensive, and it'll give people something to watch.
I think a lot of people look for kind of like the lore after that as well to
Yes.
really delve into a series. It's funny, like you get like highly successful syndicated series like Seinfeld, for
Yes.
example. I think it's the most successful, if not one of the most successful syndicated series of all time. And you see them coming back now as fast channels, which isn't that surprising because highly entertaining, right? And as you
Yeah.
mentioned, you can just keep watching and you don't feel like you're rewatching as well. And it's
Oh,
definitely that
exactly.
kind of comfort food TV.
Right, right. And and where we're seeing that sort of franchise thing happen now is with nonfiction shows, like a lot of the Discovery and HGTV. I mean, there's a show called House Hunters. I don't know, do you have that in the UK?
I
It's a,
haven't seen it.
it's a
What's
it's
the
an
premise?
it's so simple. Someone is looking to buy a house. They look at three different houses, and at the end, they pick one of them. And it's very addictive, and it has been on for about at least 25 years. Um, Super simple to produce, easy, and there's 25 years worth of it. I mean, easily 1,000 episodes of it floating around, and they have expanded it. There's a House Hunters International. There's House Hunters Beaches, Islands. There's all sorts of variations of it, but it's that simple premise. You get to try and decide. You get to try and figure out which house they're going to pick.
Yeah, we have something similar. It's called we have a place in the country, which is people looking for a countryside home, and
Yeah.
then another one is a place in the sun because obviously the UK gets no sun. So,
Yes.
yeah, it's relatively successful here as well as a model.
Right, right, and that's very. And a friend of mine had once done a study. He had sort of timed it. There's like about 9 or 10 minutes of actual original content during a half-hour show, and the rest of it is like, here's what we're going to see, before the commercial break. Here's what we're going to see after the commercial break, and here's a little bit of original. And now here's what we're going to cut to a commercial, but let's just recap and.
You mentioned there about the carriage and retrans fees which you have in the US. With those networks then looking to switch to streaming, where do you think they're going to look to make up those losses?
I think some of it is going to come from subscription fees. I think they're going to raise subscription fees. I think that ad-free subscriptions may go up in price. I think a lot of them are going to start rebundling. I mean, that's a big thing that we're seeing in the U.S. now, where they're going to look to the manufacturers and also to the cable companies, the MVPDs, to sort of put together a variation of the cable bundle, basically saying instead of X number of cable networks for this money, you'll get X number of streaming services plus broadband for $100 a month or whatever it is. And that's a way to lock people in for a year at least, because right now they're on month to month. There's a high level of churn. So to answer your question, though, I think they're going to see some of it from higher subscription fees. They're hoping to see some of it from higher ad rates, too. The theory is that brands will pay more money for better targeted ads. They'll pay higher CPM on that. That remains to be seen because it's interesting, a lot of the very big brands have the attitude that they don't really care so much about targeting. Their audience is, quote, everyone with a mouth, unquote. And, and so if I'm going to make this up, if I'm a sports car manufacturer and some older woman sees my car, my target market is young men, the thought is, well, maybe she has a grandson, maybe she has a neighbor or a coworker who's in that demo. And if they buy this car or they say they're thinking about it, she'll say, oh, that's a really nice car. I've seen an ad. Money well, and from their point of view, it's money well spent. To that point, there's also a lot of DTC brands and other brands that never were able to advertise on television before, but because of the economics of streaming and being able to scale and target, they now are able to advertise on TV. So that's another place they're hoping to make up from it, just having more advertisers.
The thing that's interesting to me is it kind of brings me back to an episode of Mad Men I've watched in the past, right? In advertising, obviously, this is probably an overused analogy, but it goes back to like one of the episodes is when they're trying to make an ad for like Right Guard, for example,
Yeah.
and all of the guys are like, "Oh, we need to have like just like a spaceman on there because it's cool right now. This is current." And then Don is like, we why why are we doing that? He's like, well, that's not who we're selling to. Like
Yeah.
the people in the supermarkets at that time. Not that I
Yeah.
agree with this now,
Yeah.
but the people at that time were the wives. The wives are the
Yeah.
ones in the supermarket. So we're actually advertising to them. And it's interesting you mentioned that, like, to a brand now, they're like, oh, it might go to an older lady, but she might have a grandson.
Yeah.
And I think it's a similar thing of ad targeting sometimes isn't actually the person that the product is for in
Yeah.
that instance. It's can be someone who's related to that. So the advertising needs to be tailored to them as well. So I
Oh,
think,
very much, very much. I mean, the other thing too is like if you're a luxury car manufacturer, this I actually know. Say if you're Mercedes, like you want to put your ads in front of people who are in their 20s who don't have the money for it, so that in 20 years, when they do have the money for it, they'll know who you are and that they'll be wanting one. They will be aspiring to own a Mercedes for the last 20 years, rather than all of a sudden put it in front of them when they're in that that age range or income category.
yeah, exactly. It's kind of like the difference between what was like direct mail copy advertising
Yes.
versus what we have now, which is like uh, it's more like building a brand and rather than like a direct sale. Like you're actually trying to build that profile of the brand in the psyche of the population rather than saying like you need this product right now.
Yes. Oh, very much. Very much.
And in your latest report, that is Local TV, Perils and Promise in the Age of Streaming. Great title, by the way.
Thank you.
You mentioned that advertisers have a strong opportunity to target those ads regionally based on data, which we covered.
Right.
But we actually found in our own report, which was Consumers in the Modern Age, that people don't actually want to give their data for personalization of ads. It was kind of a catch-22 we found. They said, yeah, we want personalized ads because it's more relevant to me. But when we asked them about data sharing, they didn't want to share their data. So that's an interesting thing, I think, that we're going to have to deal with directly, like in our respective industries. And I was wondering where you think the future is going to lie on that.
It is a very interesting paradox. And we have found that too, that people act all concerned about television, but then if you sort of push them, they're like, yeah, Google knows everything about me. Google knows my porn habits, my finances, my, who I'm stalking online. They know all my dirt. Why do I care if someone knows, if Samsung knows that I watched The Office and reruns of ER on some channel? Like, it doesn't really matter. But then when you sort of get to the targeted ad part and the fact that they track your credit card spending and all that, then people get a little bit freaked out. What's interesting is there is a startup in the US that's gotten a lot of funding called Telly. And the premise behind that is we will give you a free TV in exchange for you giving us all sorts of data so that we can hit you with targeted ads. And there's a little bar at the bottom of the, sort of a separate thing. It sort of works as a sound bar, and it can run everything from sports scores to, ticker, the stock prices, but also will run ads, targeted ads. And the deal is you can't cover that up or not watch it in exchange for the free TV. So they're banking on the fact that especially younger people just don't care as much about sharing their data. By the same token, I can also see, and you're already starting to see it, some of the FASTs are saying, hey, if you do sign in, if you create an account, here's some cool stuff you get. You can, maybe you'll be able to have access to certain shows a little bit sooner. You'll be able to save things, on your account. They're trying to figure out ways to get people to give up their data. But privacy is really tricky in TV because on the one hand, people sort of don't care, but then there's a lot of sort of waving around of, your TV is tracking you, it's watching you, and people, oh, I don't want that. But then when you press them on, like, why would you care if someone knew what are you watching on TV that you wouldn't want anyone to know? They're like, yeah, you're right. And if I got better ads, if I got better targeted ads, if I didn't see, things that don't concern me, then that's better. And they look at something like Instagram and they go, okay, that's pretty cool. Like I actually enjoy enjoy may be a strong word, but I don't mind all of the ads on Instagram. A lot of times I find interesting products and things like that. So if my TV feed was like that, that would not be a bad thing.
For me, like, it's a really good point you bring up about the fact that, like, you look at social advertising, social media advertising, and compare that to maybe what like fasts are doing at the moment. The targeting I find isn't as good because of my Judge Judy habits. Everyone thinks I'm running into legal trouble all the time,
Yeah.
which is a real issue for me because I'm not in any legal trouble. So all these lawyers are wasting all of this money paying high CPMs to
Yes.
target me, but they're not getting anything. So I think I am obviously joking, but the thing is, I think the tech isn't quite caught up yet in that respect for targeting. I think that it's kind of got a ways to go to really be able to target the correct people and be as adaptive as we kind of expect it to be, especially when we look at like social media as a comparison.
Oh, very, very much. And part of that is just numbers, right? So we always say, like, if I go to Facebook and say I want to target left-handed jugglers, Facebook can go, okay, we have 100,000 of them. Here you go. But a lot of the streaming services are like, yeah, no, neither of them were watching this week. They're on vacation. Yeah, there's just not that many of them because the audience isn't there yet, and there's so many different services. I mean, think about it, like, how many social media outlets are there? There's Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and, a little bit, TikTok and maybe Snap, but there's not a whole lot of options. Whereas with television, you just got so many options that you don't have the audiences there yet. And your point is correct. The technology certainly hasn't caught up. One of the big, big issues is sort of over targeting. In other words, because, to the previous joke, there's only two left-handed jugglers. Those guys are going to see, that same ad over and over. And one of the problems, and I think this is global, is that the networks used to sell the ads themselves, so they could control frequency and what was seen. But with the streaming, because it's so programmatically, often a number of different companies are selling the ads, and they don't really talk to each other. So they may serve up the same Pepsi commercial 3 times in a row because a different company sold it each time, and this person is in the target market that they want. And that leads to a really bad consumer experience. And I know that all the streaming services are really working hard to solve that because they realize, okay, we're turning people off when we show them the same ad 4 times in the same show, often back to back. And then you also have this sort of the dead space, right? So sometimes there is no ad. Nobody wants to pay for that. And it's just like you get this black screen with a little sign on it that says, commercial break in progress. And that's not a good consumer experience either. So,
and like they say, 2 lefts don't make a right.
Yes.
So, but I do want to talk about as well what I perceive at the moment as like the elephant in the room, especially having read your report as well. ATSC 3.0, and for those not in the know, that's the television broadcasting standards created by the Advanced Television Systems Committee, which is a bit of a mouthful, admittedly. It feels to me like this tech, Alan, is a lot like Neil Young releasing the Pono player. I don't know if you remember this. It was essentially an iPod with better audio quality, right? Lossless audio, in principle, really great. But the key point here is released after Spotify, so no one really cared.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, something just happened this week or last week, actually, that really sort of seems to put the nail on ATSC 3.0, which I think the easier name they've been giving it is Next Gen TV. But regardless, which was that there was a lawsuit in the US. Some company claimed that they had a patent that LG was using, and the courts ruled that, yes, they did. And LG said, well, you know what? Then it's just too expensive for us to make these TVs, to put this in the TVs, and we're not going to do it. And the thought is that Samsung and Sony may also follow suit. Vizio, which is a huge force in the U.S., doesn't have ATSC 3.0 in their TVs, and the problem is that it's not backwards compatible. In other words, you need a new TV in order to get that signal, or you need a dongle, and the dongles are not cheap. Like the cheapest one I've seen is about $90. At which point people are like, well, I may as well just get for another $100 to get a new TV. And the audience for over the air, especially in the U.S., is not particularly a dongle-friendly audience. It's often older people with less resources. And then the final piece that seems to be the nail is the new infrastructure bill in the US, which is, billions of dollars to bring broadband access to either low income communities, and also because the US is a very big country, there are a lot of rural areas that weren't wired for even mobile, even like cell phone coverage, let alone broadband. Just wasn't worth it. There weren't enough people living there. And now they're going to start, and so they would rely on over the air. And now they're going to start wiring them up. So again, I think everything's going to move to streaming. A lot of, and I have the take, and I've seen this from a lot of people too, that ATSC 3.0 was a great idea that unfortunately came out 10 years too late. Had it come out 10 years earlier, to your point, the Neil Young point, if Spotify had still existed, if Neil Young was still on Spotify, then it could have been a great thing, but it's too late. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I've actually got a great new idea for content distribution. I've called it video held slowly, or VHS for short, and I don't know if you think it'll catch on.
Yes. Very good.
Yeah, I mean, we've covered everything here from data sharing, people, being willing to actually share their data for ads. And one thing I wanted to cover with you as well was whether you think there's possibility for more industries, retails such as like retail or healthcare, moving into the FAST ecosystem, whether there's space for them.
Oh, very much, very much. So in the US, we unfortunately have a system that allows, they call it, DTC, direct to consumer advertising for prescription drugs. It was interesting. I had once asked someone in that industry, like, why is that? Because like, if I had asthma and my doctor didn't know about the latest treatments, I'd find another doctor. Like, why are, and he said, well, you live in a major metro area and have access to good doctors, but somebody who lives in a more rural area, there's not a specialist there. So they're relying on their GP, who might not be that aware of it. So that's why they do it. And obviously it's working. But nonetheless, that industry spends billions every year. And I suspect, they will move in. Now, there's all sorts of laws about targeting, but they can sort of make assumptions based on contextual. Like, in other words, if a certain type of programming is aimed at a certain audience, if it's aimed at an older audience, whatever, they can say, okay, this is probably, and we're doing Alzheimer's drugs, this is probably who's going to be concerned about that. We'll run the ads there. Retail is another thing that's going to be huge. So there's a lot of companies, like there's companies iBuy and Curve, that are doing things with generative AI and sort of overlays to basically allow for shoppable content on TV. And I think we're going to see a lot of that now, where basically it sort of works like you'll hit the pause button and you'll be able to buy whatever it is on the screen, or you can do it afterwards. There's all different ways to do it, but that thing that they used to call Jennifer Aniston's sweater seems to finally be coming to life. So I think we're going to see a lot of retail going on there, and a lot of sort of the companies sort of giving you the ability to buy things, DTC companies, where you'll be able to buy things. And also the producers, another way to make up this lost revenue for programmers and producers, is going to be, hey, we will strike deals with companies like, hey, you give us your address, your car, your whatever, and we'll put an shoppable ad for it right in the content, so somebody hits pause and they can buy that right then and there. So I think we're going to see both things really step up.
I agree with you there on that. The one thing that is my kind of concern with it more than anything is that with like server-side ad insertion, which a lot of companies, especially with us, are utilizing now, you don't have that option for dynamic ads. That I don't mean in terms of dynamic ad insertion. I mean dynamical, like clickable ads,
Right.
so that they can actually tap the ad and be taken directly to the product. So I think that's one of the kind of hurdles I think a lot of these companies are going to have to overcome, and the tech is again going to have to catch up in a way. Because otherwise you get that problem always with like retail and most other things where you're actually purchasing a product of basket abandonment, right?
Yes.
Because otherwise, if you're not making it super easy for them to purchase that product they've seen, they're probably going to be like, well, actually, do I need this?
Oh, very much, very much. And a lot of it too is going to depend on the type of show it is. In other words, if it's a show that I'm just watching, there's sort of that lean in. If it's a show that I'm watching straight through, I'm not going to stop and buy something. But if it's something that I've seen before, or like a nonfiction show, like people always talk about the home and garden shows, how those are such brilliant, like if it's a cooking show, right? and at the end of it, you can buy the recipe and have it delivered. That's an easy fit. And so I think it really, certain categories are going to see a lot more of that than others. Than somebody buying a $500 dress off that they saw on a TV show.
Yeah, definitely. If you can send me the link to that Jennifer Aniston sweater, though, I'd really appreciate it.
Yes, certainly.
Thank you so much, Alan. We've covered everything here from, as I mentioned, data sharing, fast for retail and healthcare now as well, and even obsolete new tech, as we've kind of deemed ATS to be at the moment. But I just want to thank you personally, Alan, for your time today. It's been great chatting with you, really insightful. And I hope everyone learned something. I certainly did. But yeah, thank you.
And thank you. This was great. It was a great conversation, and it was really nice. So thank you.
Well, there we have it. That's all the time we had with our razor sharp and witty commentator, Alan Wolk. I certainly learned a thing or two about FAST and the current ad landscape in the UK and the US. I think we can certainly see a future where localization is going to be extremely important, especially for advertisers and especially for other sectors that may not have entered the FAST ecosystem just yet, such as retail or healthcare. Thank you for your time today. We'll see you next time.
If you're still listening, please don't forget to give us a rating and review in your podcast directory of choice. It means an awful lot for a growing podcast like ours. Make sure you subscribe to be alerted when the next episode of Beyond the Stream will drop. Until next time.